Hi everybody, it's time for diversity class. We're going to do kind of a compact interview with me, a compact lecture on the concept of hate groups and how this ties into our discussion on diversity. So we are going to be going kind of up on the pyramid of hate that we've been discussing, away from microaggression into the real genocidal aggression, I guess. This lecture is sponsored by coffee from the Star Trek Enterprise series from the early 2000s, which is really all not to be about 9/11. There was a section of the Hilton in Las Vegas for a while that was completely dedicated to Star Trek nerds, and it was awesome. I was so sad to see it go. So this is some nice early 2000s Star Trek coffee with a little bit of maple infused whiskey in it, because the coronavirus. Yeah. So we're gonna kind of take a slice of how we talk about hate groups, and I'm hoping that people, when we discuss this in Zoom, will see the sort of the connections between the traditional notion of hate groups and what's happening now, especially with regards to the people that are protesting the coronavirus shutdowns in Oregon and around the country, because there's a huge overlap, and I'm going to send you a little link. We'll post it below about that. Okay, how do we start this thing? Well, let's start with, oh gosh, my wife gave me a treatment tonight in my hair. It's all sticky. This is what you do when you're stuck at home. I got a treatment, and she's going to cut it tomorrow. We'll see how that goes. When you think of the term hate group, what comes to mind? Right, there's some pretty traditional images that come to mind. You think of the Ku Klux Klan, a racist hate group that initially was formed after the end of the Civil War in Pulaski, Tennessee, and in the 1800s, reborn in my hometown in Stone Mountain in 1915. You think of neo-Nazis, of the people with the swastika armbands marching around. You might think of racist skinheads, and you think of sort of organized hate. So the first step of this is coming up with a definition for what is and what isn't a hate group, because that term could be thrown around a lot. For example, the Southern Poverty Law Center, a group that really sort of marks and charts and tracks hate groups in America, includes black nationalist groups like the New Black Panthers and the Black Israelites, some of these sort of anti-Semitic black groups in their list of hate groups, who are essentially, black hate groups who see white people, among others, as inferior. Some people could say, look at the Mormon Church and its backing of anti-gay ballots around the country. Is the Mormon Church a hate group? Some people might want to make that argument. The federal government, thinking of its long history of institutionalized racism, including and especially the genocide of Native Americans, is the federal government of the United States a hate group? So we really kind of have to start this discussion with a working definition or criteria of what is a hate group. And I published a piece, I guess about 10 years ago, about trying to do this, because there's really no formal definition. And what I did in this piece is came up with sort of a criteria by which we could figure out what is and what isn't a hate group. And I did this work just doing a lot of analysis of the way terrorist groups are defined, the way hate groups are defined, talking to people at the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League, and trying to come up with sort of a working definition. So here's our kind of 4 criteria by which, when we use the term hate group, what we mean. Okay, and I'm going to flash this up on the screen so you can follow along. The first criteria is a hate group is a collection of people who hold a common disdain, which is a fancy way of saying hate, for one or more large categories of people. And these groups are sort of organized around that hatred. It can't be just sort of one of the things that they do, because you could say the Catholic Church has a long hatred of women, but that's not why the Catholic Church exists. I hope so anyway. I guess people can make that argument. So the first is a group of people that hold a common hatred, a common disdain for one or more people. So that's criteria number 1. Number 2 is they have a name. They are a named entity. They can't just be a mob of people. They have to have some name, and that name might be borrowed. The Oregon Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, or the Portland chapter of the Proud Boys, or they have to have a name, and it could be a name that goes way back, or it could be they've just come up with a fun, funky name. Criteria number 3 is they desire, and this is an important one, that they desire the oppression of one or more large categories of people based on some historical circumstance. So there has to be a kind of desire to do some ill will to the group of people that they hate that ties into some historical oppression. Because it's hard to talk about historically oppressing white people or straight people. A lot of that is just the response to historical oppression, kind of like the case that's made in White Fragility is you can't have reverse racism. You can have people who are angry at racist or angry at white people for not dealing with racism, but that in of itself is not racism. Racism, as we've talked about, is defining a group of people as inferior. So they have to want to act on that. It's one thing just to say things, but they have to want something bad to happen to those people, that they're not allowed in the country, or they're not allowed out of the closet, or some form of oppression. And the fourth one, and this is the one that really sort of separates a lot of sort of people who are just talking a lot of hate from people who are really formal hate groups, is they must act on that hate. They must act on that collective disdain. And that action could be something just like putting up a website. It doesn't have to be burning a cross in front of somebody's yard or murdering somebody. They have to do something to express their hate. It could be holding a rally, could be putting up flyers, it could be graffitiing. You know, they have to commit some act, legal or otherwise, that reflects this desire to oppress other people. And when you put all four of those together, you can get rid of some things like the Mormon Church. Well, Mormon Church isn't organized around its hatred towards gay people. In fact, it's made huge progress in the last 50 years around the issue of sexuality. And there are lots of people within the Mormon faith who are now embracing alternative sexualities. So Mormon Church is not a hate group based on this criteria. The Confederate Hammerskins are a hate group. Proud Boys who want to, kick immigrants out of this country and put women back in the kitchen, they're a hate group. Sorry, fellas. And so when we have that, we start with a kind of orientation about what is and what isn't a hate group. And then there are different ways of organizing hate groups. And there has been a whole pantheon of hate. And we used to use the term the white supremacist movement, because when we talk about hate, we're talking about mostly racially motivated hatred, but there's also a lot of sexism, a lot of homophobia, a lot of xenophobia. I mean, there's all kinds of hates that are woven into this. But when we talk about this, we've used the language of the WSM, the white supremacist movement. We've really moved away from that language because it's not much of a movement. It's not very organized. I've testified in murder trials to this fact that there isn't one overarching agenda. There's a lot of sort of sub-agendas. There's a lot of infighting. And so talking about it as a movement is kind of problematic. A little bit, people can make that case, but we kind of now refer to it as the white supremacist or the hate counterculture. And there have been some kind of famous elements of this. And so I'll just list off some of the well-known ones. And this was organized by a guy named Ridgway, who wrote a wonderful book called Blood on the Face, which was an attempt to kind of translate for a larger audience the level of hate groups that are out there in the traditional way. So we talk about groups like the Ku Klux Klan, organized primarily as a racist group in 1866, but a lot of people don't know that the Ku Klux Klan's secondary target, so they were upset. They were Confederate soldiers who had lost the war, as they called it, the War of Northern Aggression, to the United States of America. USA won in that one. USA v. CSA, USA won. So if you're pro-Confederate, you're anti-USA. Just to like to remind people of that fact. So they were afraid, they were angry that the slaves had been freed. And so, of course, they targeted a lot of free slaves in their night riding terrors. I mean, they wore the costume of the ghosts of their fallen comrades in the Confederate Army. So those white sheets were meant to be ghosts, to spirits. And the term Ku Klux Klan Ku Klux is Greek for circle. So it became Ku Klux Klan, like family, and I thought it'd be clever with all Ks. And the Night Riders in the late 1860s and early 1870s targeted free blacks in the South, but also targeted Republicans, because who defeated the South? The army of Lincoln. Lincoln was a Republican. They sent the carpetbaggers down to reconstruct the South and try to form the South into the North's more more democratic image, I guess. And so I think it's important to point out that the party of Lincoln was also a target. Of course, the Republican Party has changed a little bit in the last few years. I don't know, I've been paying attention since about Nixon. And they were reformed again. They were sort of suppressed by the federal government. The first time the federal government uses the term terrorism is in its act to suppress the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s, and they pretty much drove them out of business. But they were reborn again in my hometown, Stone Mountain, in 1915, when a guy saw the movie Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation, the famous first epic film by D.W. Griffith in 1915, was based on a book called The Klansman, and was a glorification of the 1860s and 70s Klan that was incredibly racist, incredibly sexist, and this guy saw the movie, and he got some old Klansmen from the 1860s and climbed up Stone Mountain, which I've climbed many times in my life, burned a cross for the first time, and the Klan was reborn, starting a century of terror. And so the Klan still exists. The Klan is still active, especially in southern states. The Klan dominated this country in the 1920s. Oregon had the largest Klan per capita in the whole country. The Klan elected the governor here in Oregon and ran Catholic and Jews out of the state. It boycotted Jewish businesses and tried to shut down Catholic schools, including St. Mary's. And the Klan was hugely active here in the 1920s and still had a presence all the way into the 20th century. So the Klan is sort of a traditional group. And one of the things I want to say about the Klan is a Christian organization. They believe all the message that God is a white man and Jesus is a white man. And like we were talking about with the history of racism, that the people of Africa were subhuman beings. And they don't burn crosses. The Klan lights crosses to cleanse them. And they see themselves as a Christian organization. So if you think about something like Al-Qaeda seeing itself as a Muslim organization, 99.9% of Muslims are going to be like, those people aren't Muslims. And just like I would hope that 99.8% of Christians would say the Klan aren't Christian. But they promoted themselves as Christian. And then we get a group that emerges in the 1970s called Christian Identity, which is a kind of updating of the Christian ideology. Christian Identity is a racial reading of the Bible. It sees the Bible, the Old Testament Word of God, as the holy, truth, and that God is a white man. Again, we get all these images. And if you Google image God, I challenge you to do this. Just next time on Google image, just put God in and see what comes up. Overwhelmingly, you get these pictures of these old white guys, look like Gandalf or something. And the God is white. God created all that stuff. So God creates Adam. Adam is white. God creates Eve out of Adam, so Eve is white. And then the reading of the Bible is that the story of Cain and Abel, right, the sons of Adam and Eve, where Cain kills Abel. Do you know this story? I feel like we should have Sunday school. Yeah, Cain kills Abel with the jawbone of an ass, or the ass bone of a jaw. I can never remember. That Abel was the son of Adam and Eve and was white, and Cain was the son of Eve and the serpent, the devil, and Cain was the first Jew. And so in the early books of the Bible, Genesis, you get the children of God, the descendants of Adam, and the children of the devil, the descendants of Cain, in a kind of holy battle. And all the people who are not white are sort of from the Garden of Eden, the animals, the subhuman animals, the mud people as they call them. And so Christian Identity looks at Genesis as the beginning of a racial conflict in America between whites and Jews and non-whites, and sees the end of the book, Revelations, that's the last chapter, spoiler alert, there's a holy war, as a race war to restore the kingdom of white people back on earth. So Christian Identity was set up in Idaho and had a big presence here in the Northwest for a long time. They've faded a little bit. The American Nazi Party is another one. We think of neo-Nazi. Neo is just the word meaning new. Neo-Nazis actually weren't neo. They were the real Nazis. There was a strong element of anti-Semitism in American culture. There always has been. And in the 1920s, as Hitler was starting to percolate in Germany, we had our own version of that happening here, including from a guy named Henry Ford. that Henry Ford, Ford Auto Company. Henry Ford was a virulent anti-Semite, believed that Jews controlled the world, believed that Jews ran the banks and Hollywood, and on and on and on. And Hitler loved Ford. Hitler wrote about him in Mein Kampf. And wanted him to run for president so he didn't have to go to war against the United States. And so this theme, wasn't unique to Germany, the anti-Semitism that Germany was experiencing. Of course, when we go to war against Germany, a lot of that stuff sort of disappears because the Nazis are the bad guys. But then in the 1960s, it starts popping up again as a response to the hippies, all the people that were growing their hair and peace and love and don't fight and being against the war. All of a sudden, the Nazis roared back, especially a group called the American Nazi Party and a guy named George Lincoln Rockwell. And so the American Nazi Party becomes very, very active and provocative in through the end of the 20th century, and a group that emerges in the early 21st century called the National Socialist Movement, which has also had a huge presence, again, based largely on notions of anti-Semitism, of what we've talked about. And there are several other groups, including patriot militia groups, we'll talk a little bit about, and the skinheads that sort of emerged in the 1980s in this country, which has been the focus of a lot of my research. But it's all sort of wrapped around this notion of white Christianity. It's a theme that sort of drives all these folks. But we do get some new groups that emerge in the 1980s and 1990s, just sticking with the religious theme, which are the Odinists. And now Odin, if those of you that, like me, grew up with Thor comic books, I read a lot of Thor, and then these movies started coming out, so now there's a whole generation of Thor fans that never even read the comic books, know that who Odin is. Odin is the king of the Norse gods, of the Viking gods. He's like the Zeus of the Norse gods, and Thor is his son. And we have a lot of that influence on our culture. Wednesday is named after Woden, which is the German name for Odin. Thursday is Thor's Day. I don't know if you knew that. So we have a lot of that in our culture. And the Norse mythology, which a lot of people are into now, Norse mythology is really big, was a very vibrant belief in pre-Christian Northern Europe. The Celtics and the Vikings and all those folks really had this heavy ancestral worship. And one of the things that's interesting about the Christian identity folks and the Ku Klux Klan folks is having to reconcile the issue of Jesus and their racism. Because if you read the New Testament, Jesus was kind of a liberal, kind of a hippy-dippy guy. Love your enemy and turn the other cheek and all that stuff. And it also takes place in the Middle East, right? So how white was Jesus really? So I'll tell you a little story that I love to tell about when I was doing my research. I was touring with this great rock band, Driving and Crying, and we had a tour with the reformed Lynyrd Skynyrd in 1991. The guys that went down in a plane, Sweet Home Alabama, Freebird, those guys, they reformed. The dead singer's little brother was singing, and it was great. We were on the road. And it was the last night of the tour in Birmingham, Alabama. Sweet Home Alabama. And the way that I would work these shows is I would, take care of my band who played first. And then when everything was put away, I'd kind of go and hang out in the crowd and watch Lynyrd Skynyrd and watch the audience. Because surprise, surprise, there was a lot of racism at Lynyrd Skynyrd concerts. Rebel flags, Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, all that stuff. And there was a Klan recruiter who had been working the crowds. And it was the last night of the tour in Alabama. We're going home the next day. And this guy, and I knew he was a Klan recruiter because he had a pin on that said IKEA. Not like the furniture store, but means a Klansman I am. It's a little signature that the Klansmen wear. And he came up to me because he'd seen me at all these shows. So he must have figured I was a fellow traveler. And he said, "Hey, man, can I ask you a question?" It was more like, "Hey, man, can I ask you a question?" And that was last night of the tour, and everybody was like, "Woo!" Jack Daniels and Jim Beam, and that was just me, Jim Beam. Southerner by the grace of God. What was I saying? Oh yeah, comes someone and asked me, "Hey man, can I ask you a question?" I'm like, "Oh God, here it comes." He said, "Do you believe in the white race?" And I don't believe in the white race. The white race is a social construction of reality. There is no white people. We're all just sort of skin tones. And I could have been like, "No, I don't believe in the white race. Go away. I want to watch this band." But I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna see where this goes." I'm like, "Yeah, I believe in the white race." He says, do you believe in the supremacy of the white race? And, most people at this point are either going to say, yeah, man, hell yeah, or leave me alone, I don't want to hear your crap. And so I thought, especially after a little bit of Jim Beam, I thought I'd mess with him. I said, no, actually, I believe in the supremacy of the black race. And the look on his face, I'll never forget, was like he was not expecting to hear it from some white guy at a Skinner show in Birmingham. And he's like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, if you study your history, you'll see while Europeans were still living in caves, Africans were building civilizations. The root of what would become ancient Egypt was long before any, white people were like, hey, let's be civilized. And so then he started, and he was like really like not prepared for this. And then he started talking about Jesus. Jesus this, Jesus us. Klan is, total Christian organization. And I said, well, hold on a second. There's some historical evidence that Mary probably came from what is now Ethiopia, and Jesus was dark skinned. And without missing a beat, this guy said, Jesus, he said, we're trying to talk. I'm trying to convince him, that Jesus was probably a brown brother. And he, without missing a beat, says, Mary was from England. Like, how did that work? Like, she caught the nonstop to Bethlehem and got knocked up in coach on the way, Immaculate Conception. And then I started talking, about James Brown being the hardest working man in show business, proving black supremacy, and he took a swing at me. He just was not having it. But it showed the problem with these sort of Christian groups trying to justify or rationalize the way we think of this Middle Eastern religion about loving your enemy and their incredible hatred towards people of color and their desire for violence towards them. So what happens to reconcile that is a sort of new religion emerges called Odinism. And Odinism goes way back. It goes way back before Christianity, but it kind of gets reborn in Iceland in the 1970s. And there's a version of it that becomes white supremacist, that says that Christianity is a Jewish plot to make men weak, to make them love their enemy. Odinism is a fierce warrior religion. The way you earn your way into Valhalla, into heaven, is through battle. You don't turn the other cheek. You smite your enemy with a hammer, and it's a very violent version of this ancient pagan belief, and becomes incredibly popular as these white supremacist Christians start, having this cognitive dissonance. It becomes very popular in prisons, and then sort of merges onto the mainstream of the world of hate. In fact, Volksfront, the dominant hate group here in Oregon, it was connected to a pretty brutal murder in Tacoma that I testified in that murder trial, were adherents of Odinism or Asatru. And so this is sort of a new religion or new religious angle for some of these hate groups. And then, there are lots of other versions of hate groups too. We could have anti-immigrant groups. We could have neo-Confederate groups who want to bring the South back. We have, really heavy misogynist groups like the incels who, really hate women, and there's a whole bunch of them. We don't have time to get into all of them. But I will include a link from the ADL or the Southern Poverty Law Center that gives you the link of the whole wonderful world of hate that's out there. But they are often in conflict with each other. I mean, they're often there are these religious conflicts about being Christian or being Odinist or being Satan worships, or some of them are. Some of them are, not many. They're conflicted over the role of women. These groups are very racist, but they're also incredibly sexist. They believe, women should be in the kitchen baking cookies, and very few of them think that we can elevate women to roles of leadership because they think that that's a challenge to white male patriarchy. They're also in conflict over the definition of whiteness. Who is white? 100 years ago, Irish people were not considered to be white people, but they have been sort of included into the white people club. White supremacists can count them as recruits. I was doing an interview with a white supremacist Odinist priestess, coffee shop just on the road, and I said, "Hey, who's white? Who do you determine as white? What's your definition of who gets to be in the white club?" She looked at me and she sort of went like this and said, "If you look white and act white and are white in your heart, then you're white." And I was like, I'm out. That's not me. But what kind of holds these groups together? What is some of the sort of overview that kind of holds these groups together? Well, there are some themes, and some friends of mine have done some research, and this is based on a piece that was published by Chipperley and Stas Vysotsky in 2006 that I think really, really rings true to the present. They talked about sort of three themes, the three meta frames in hate groups. The first is the value of conspiracy, what they would call conspiracism, that there are always these conspiracy theories about dark shadow puppet masters who control things. Usually it's a sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that the Jews control the world, that the Jewish thing is a single. Every time I talk to one of my Jewish friends about that, they're like, we control the world? How do I get in on that? But there are some shadow government controlling things behind this. And of course, we have a president who loves conspiracy theories. He's brought conspiracy theories back about the deep state and the Wuhan flu and all these conspiracy theories. And there's a whole psychology. There's been a whole chunk written about how people of a certain mindset, very binary thinkers, really latch on to conspiracy theories. The rest of us understand that everything's a shade of gray and these conspiracy theories don't hold up. But people like white supremacists really latch on to this conspiracism, and our president, who may or may not be a white supremacist. The second thing is what they call dualism, or what we might talk about the binary, that the world is divided into the world of good folks versus the evil folks. And there's sort of this easy dichotomy, and that allows you to demonize the enemy, right? They're evil, they're less than human, they're savage, they want to take your daughter away, what we would call othering. And then your side is the heroic side. You're saving the day. You're saving the race. You're saving the planet. You're saving the country. You are the great patriot who's going to save everything. And it's very us versus them, which we've been talking a lot about in this class, the power of that binary, the power of that dichotomy. And then the third thing, and this is an important part that's happening right now, is this notion of apocalyptic visions, that there is a collapse that's about to happen. And it's all about to fall in, and if you don't act now, you have to act now, save your race or will forever be gone, or save your country or will forever be gone. There's sort of some approaching confrontation that is going to reveal some great hidden truth, and you need to act now. Which side are you on? And so, we've seen that many times, but we're certainly seeing it now, right? The people who are the anti-coronavirus lockdown protesters think America is going to be destroyed and their freedom is going to be taken away and the government's going to take away their guns and yada, yada, yada. So they have to act now. There's a sense of desperation of this sort of pending apocalypse, and that's always a part of these groups. And I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and it's always about 5 years down the road, it's all going to collapse. And if we don't save white people's world now, it's going to forever be gone. And so 5 years and 5 years and 5 years, just around the corner. So they talk about these meta frames that sort of hold them together, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. This notion of conspiracism, the dualism, the us versus them, the binary, and the apocalyptic vision. That's something that we see in these hate groups in 2020 that we're dealing with. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about the appeal of these hate groups. How are we still dealing with them in the 21st century? Well, the first thing, and this is something those of you that have had sociology classes are going to understand, is this notion of anomie. The sense of normlessness and what it means when you have a rapid change, when things are happening very quickly. Think about how much we've changed in the last 50 years in terms of our demographics. America is less white than it used to be. In terms of gender, America is less male-dominated than it used to be. In terms of sexual orientation, America is gayer than it used to be and transer than it used to be. In terms of our economy, right? We are not a manufacturing economy anymore. We are a service sector economy, and that's about to go away too, as we're all kind of stuck online. That rapid change can be very exciting for people, but for other people, that sense of normlessness, that anomie that comes with all that change, is disorienting, and they want to go back. And there's a mythology about a simpler time, and you read about this in White Fragility, about the good old days, this idea of going back to when things made sense. Let's make America great again, when we didn't have to deal with transgender bathrooms and, on and on and on, feminists and, all that stuff. And so there's this romanticization of the past that is the sort of solution to the anomie that people experience. And we all do. I mean, I'm going to tell you right now, as maybe someone who's a little bit older than you, we always romanticize the past. It's always better back then. Oh man, back then when people played records, oh, those were the days. What's wrong with you kids with your Spotify? You don't know what it's like not to be able to find a record. It's always better in the past. Not necessarily. The past was awesome and shitty. I mean, think about TV. I mean, I used to have to hold the rabbit ears on the TV so my dad could watch the golf match. It sucked. My TV is awesome. It wasn't better in the past. It's so much better now. So, you know, the reality isn't black or white, but these people have put it in a binary. The past was better. Straight white men, cisgendered, you know, whatever, able-bodied, didn't have to worry about shit in those days. Let's go back to those days. And so this romanticization of the past is a solution to the anomie. And these groups work that angle. They want to take you back. They want to take you back. One of the mottos of the Proud Boys is, we revere the housewife. Like, get in the kitchen and make a sandwich. Right? What are you doing out there telling me what to do, Governor? You know, there is this desire to go back to the past. So part of the big appeal of this is anomie. There's also the rebelliousness of it, right? You want to, like, be rebellious, so you put a swastika on something that everybody else is putting a peace sign on, and there's part of that as well. There's the appeal of conspiracy theories, the power of knowing what really is going on, that who's controlling what, whether it's about UFOs or who shot JFK or who controls, the Republican and the Democratic Party. There's this real simplistic worldview, right? Everything is binary, everything is black and white, the good people and the bad people, and it's very solution oriented. Like, here's the problem. These people are taking away our world, and here's the solution. We're going to take it back. So it offers both an analysis and an action plan. That's really important, right? When we're struggling for answers, what do we do about this coronavirus? What's the real solution? We've got an analysis, but we don't know what to do about it, so it's disorienting. They have the analysis, the Jews control the world, or feminists want to turn your daughter into a lesbian. I mean, whatever their beef is of the moment, they've got an analysis and they've got a solution, which is hyper-masculine war. RAHOWA, racial holy war, is a term that a lot of these folks use, that they're going to reclaim. Second American Revolution, the Second Civil War, the Boogaloo. They have all these phrases about how they're going to use violence to take America back to the way that they think that it used to be, which it never was. I mean, it's just a myth. It's hyper-masculine, so violence is a way of solving problems. You can recruit a lot of young males. You better believe during this lockdown, they are looking at young males who are stuck at home playing video games and recruiting them through these online game platforms, Discord and, stuff like that. They're finding these guys who are like, are worried that the world that is supposed to look like them is disappearing, and pulling them in with this apocalyptic rhetoric. And then for a lot of people also, it's emotional. It's a family replacement. Your dad was absent. Here's this macho Nazi or Klansman or skinhead that's going to take care of you. The good news about this, all this darkness, because there's a lot of bad news, and we'll have a chance to talk about this in Zoom, including the desire for massive amounts of violence. I mean, one of the things that always haunts me, we just marked the 25th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Timothy McVeigh drove a rental truck full of ammonium nitrate in front of a federal building, lit a fuse, and walked away, and blew up the federal building, killing 168 people, including 19 children who were in a daycare facility. 19 babies dead. That guy is a hero. He was a hero to the guy who stabbed the people on the MAX train in 2017. Jeremy Christian wrote a sort of a love poem to Timothy McVeigh on the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, and there's a lot of people out there that think that is just about to happen. Right? When all this collapses, they're ready to blow stuff up. And they've tried. The FBI has broken up so many of the plots of these guys. But the good news is, besides all of this sort of fear of this type of thinking from these folks that are like the least equity practicing inclusive people in the world, is a lot of them leave. There's an amazing traffic of of people who are in this world then realize it's bullshit, realize it doesn't explain anything, realize the binary is really just a shade of gray, and they leave it. And there's a wonderful organization that I've done some work with called Life After Hate. There are former members of white supremacist and extremist groups that are now on the other side, sort of like the best people to talk to kids about not joining gangs or former gang members. That's the work that these people do. And I knew when I was doing my research, some of these people, they were like the toughest, most psycho Nazis in the world, and now they've come out of it and are doing work on the other side because they realize the fallacy of all these things that sort of brought them in, and the fallacy of the conspiracy theories and the fallacy of the binary thinking and the apocalyptic vision, and that the world is more enjoyable the more diverse it is, the more inclusive it is, the more equity that we work toward, the more joy that we get. And so the good news about this is, even though we've got this kind of weird counterculture that preaches violence and they're completely intolerant, they would probably have all kinds of things to say about a class like this. In fact, I've already had to bounce someone from the Facebook or from the YouTube page for trying to start shit up, a little troll. The good news is we can pull those people out, and they can be great allies on our side. And that's the work that we do. That's the work that we really try to do to make a world a safer place, but also, instead of fighting hate with hate, fighting hate with love, and inviting those people out for a good Chinese dinner, some Coronas, the beer, I mean, not the disease. All right, that's a super quick overview I just wanted to give you. Now I'm going to enjoy my Star Trek coffee. Peace, you guys.